Now, good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for waiting. I think we have so many students here. I see my students as well. Thank you for coming. Today we will have wonderful panelists that we're going to have a conversation about the recent case of Brisa de Angulo versus Bolivia from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And also, I wanted to thank George Washington Law School also for having us in their house. I'm Barbara Jimenez Santiago, human rights lawyer and regional representative for Latin America and the Caribbean for Equality Now. Also, recently this year, I became part of the faculty, adjunct faculty here in George Washington Law School with my two colleagues, Alisa Johnson and Shada Vance. So thank you for our colleagues from Hawksforward. Thank you for being here. And also other colleagues from Hawksforward that I see in the background as well that help us a lot during the process of the case. And we're gonna start here. Okay. Let me know if, can you hear me well? No, it's too far. Too far. Here. Yeah. I know this is used to here, but we're gonna make it work. And this conversation, we plan to have a conversation, a mixed conversation about the judgment, the findings, but also the strategy behind the case, and also technicalities on the process, but also next steps. What are the things since the judgment come to alive? What are the things are happening in the ground, and a little bit of everything. And so we're going to start with Brisa. We're going to start, she's going to put us on the facts, right? What is the general facts of the case, and especially what happened when she tried to look for justice in Bolivia. That's the main part that we wanted to hear from her today. What are the different barriers she faced in the process? So make her to get to the Inter-American system. So Brisa, I know that there's one mic here.
What am I supposed to push it? Push. It's on. Okay. Can you hear me well? Okay. So thank you so much for having me here today. It is always a big privilege to be able to talk about this judgment. It's been 21 years in the making, so it is a lot of effort that has come, and I think it's a dream that we had for a long time, and to see it into fruition is very exciting. So a little bit about my story. I was one of the first adolescents to take a rape case to court, and pretty much I was challenging the status quo that's what as girls we're here for. Wherever I went, that was one of the phrases they would say, well, you're a girl, what else do you expect? Like, why are you even making a fuss about this? I couldn't find any lawyers who wanted to take my case. There was no institutions that wanted to take my case, and there were no prosecutors who wanted to take my case. But there was a lot of push of me telling the story that this was a rape case. But I faced, sadly, the same judgment that the girls today are facing, which is, you must have done something to provoke it. You must be lying. You could have stopped it. You like all this buts and trying to minimize and trying to justify, trying to make it seem like your problem is your misinterpretation of things and not really what happened. And so I went to a prosecutor who like for hours would question me or told me that she would put me in jail, or just like on and on, trying to make me seem like I was the one that was making a problem. I was the one who was going to destroy the family. I was the one who was being cruel. But then I went through like forensic doctors who were not trained on how to do the forensic examination and do a lot of human rights violations, 2 judges who didn't want to take my case and who intimidated me and victimized me and did secondary victimization. But this was just the norm. Like I don't want you to think that, oh, your case is like so unique. No, this was the norm, and it still is the norm. This is how girls are treated, not only in Bolivia, but throughout the globe. If you are a victim of sexual violence, there's always this like judgment of like, you must have done something to provoke it. And if you're an adolescent, that's even higher. What in this process, after being raped and going through all that process of being victimized by a family member who's supposed to protect you, I developed bulimia, anorexia, self-mutilation, depression, anxiety, all the common things that tend to happen as a coping mechanism of wanting to leave the reality that I was living. And in that process, I attempted suicide twice. And in the last suicide attempt, I was blessed enough to have been in a place where there was a social worker who knew that this was just a symptom of something that was deeper, not what everybody else, like, she's just a teenager acting, misbehaving. She's like, no, this is a symptom of something really bad. And she sent me to a specialized program in the US where for the first time I disclosed sexual violence. But in the process, as a protection mechanism, this social worker, she was scared I was going to attempt suicide again. She takes me to this training that she has. And for the first time, I realized that this is a big problem. I'm not the only one. In fact, 1 in 3 girls or 1 in 4 girls are being sexually abused before the age of 18. And 1 in every 7 boys are being sexually abused before 18. And the majority of them are being sexually abused in their homes by someone that they trust. And they say, no, this is ridiculous. Like, how come I've never heard about this? How come we've never heard about this? We sometimes hear about things that happen in college or something that happens in work or something that happens in a dark alley, but not that it is our own family. It is the own people who are supposed to protect us. And so that's when I decided to start a Breeze of Hope, a nonprofit that provides free legal, social, and psychological services to children. And when we started seeing children coming in, I realized I had to offer a lot more than just, I believe in you and you're not alone. I had to provide a lot more. So that's when I started going to training myself, and I did psychology, and then I did my master's in neuropsychology, specialized on how trauma affects the brain, because that was, my own healing and trying to understand myself, but also to provide a process for them. But I started seeing that the same human rights violations in my case continue to happen. And so I started reaching out to different organizations, trying to see if they would take my case to Inter-American Court and say, well, I want to bring Bolivia into the court. And I kept seeing people rejected. And that's when I decided that I would become my own lawyer, even though it was going to take a lot longer. So my husband and I, well, we weren't married by then. But we went to law school precisely to start this process. And when we got to our first year, we convinced a teacher who's like thinking outside the box and everything, but we convinced her that we needed to start a human rights clinic to take my case. So she was on board, and we started a human rights clinic. And so it was a lot of conflict, because it's like, well, you can't be the petitioner and a lawyer at the same time, but they made an exception. And so in that process, after that, we once we submitted the petition, we were able to get other people on board. And GWI was, George Washington Law School was one of the universities that got involved. And there were law students helping to put all this paperwork. And then we got Equality Now to join. And then we got Hugh Hubbard Reed. Am I saying it right? I always confuse the words. And then we got independent lawyers just to come and support in the case. But my goal was never and has never been to punish or to seek some type of personal redress, but it's been to bring into awareness what girls are actually living through, and the call that we need to create reforms. We need to change the way things have been done. And so for 20 years, I've been working with over 2,300 children who've been sexually abused, taking their cases. And so with my knowledge, academic knowledge and research knowledge, we've done a lot of research, but also with my practical knowledge about what are the bottlenecks. And when I came to the judgment, they said, well, what do you want for you? And I said, well, I don't want anything for me, but I want these 11 reforms. If you really want to repair and try, I need the non-repetition. And so I presented the 11 reforms, and it was very exciting to see that the judgment touched on this 11. I don't know how long I have to talk, but I could talk forever.
Thank you, Brisa. And as she was mentioned, the case was 13 years in the Inter-American system until we got a judgment. 20 years since everything started in Bolivia. She didn't mention the whole process, 3 trials, and one still open that she's going to have a hearing soon next week. At the same time, during the process in the Inter-American Commission, as what she was mentioning, like many people got involved, into the process, many research around regional analysis about where the laws around sexual violence, where were discriminatories and the barriers. So, you know, it was a process of waiting for the judgment that we knew that will be very good to support Brisa in the individual capacity, but also for girls in Bolivia and the rest of the region. And to talk a little bit more about the judgment and the findings and what are the new standards, where the, you know, where the court stand now regarding sexual violence against children, girls, boys, and adolescents, I will let you with Dean Solorio. I don't think she needs introduction. Everyone knows her. Thank you, Dean, for being with us.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And for me, it's truly wonderful to have the opportunity to discuss such a landmark judgment, you know, for girls and sexual violence and incest. And I want to start by acknowledging Brisa. I felt so honored to be part of your journey, at least a little part, you know, and to see your case progress, you know, since the moment that I was at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to the flourishing of this amazing judgment. I'm a big admirer. I think you're an inspiration to many of us, right? So I salute you today, and I'm very happy that you're in my house today. Okay? And I also want to recognize the amazing work of the litigation team here. We have Hugh Hubbard, who's here. We have a team of attorneys here from Hugh Hubbard. We have Equality Now. We have Shelby Quest. You know, we have all these. We even have Mary Ellsberg back there, who actually worked in this amazing amici brief and supported the case. You know, there's a lot of people that have been involved in this case over the years, and there's many students in the room, right? And many of us teach human rights, including 4 of us here, right? And one thing that's very important to understand, you know, is that intersectoral collaboration in these cases is extremely important. And I get a lot of questions from students as to, well, if I go into a law firm, can I still do, you know, work that I contribute to society and advance human rights? And you can, you know, some of the attorneys here actually work for Hugh Hubbard, and they were leaders in this case. You know, they did an amazing work in this case. So it kind of gives you an idea of the different things that you can do, you know, as a human rights lawyer in the future. But I want to talk a little bit about the judgment and why the judgment is so significant, okay? It's not the first time that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights addresses issues concerning girls and sexual violence, but it is the first time that the court takes the standards to a level that it hasn't before, okay? So I want to touch on 4 aspects in particular that I think are landmarks for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and also give hope for future cases in this area. One of them is that the court strengthens what we call the legal standard or the benchmark of due diligence when it comes to the investigation, judgment, and sanction of cases related to sexual violence and incest, especially those related to girls. The court discusses in particular something that the court calls in Spanish, we still don't have a translation, so I'm going to say it in Spanish, criterio reforzado de celeridad, which means a reinforced duty to act expeditiously in these cases. The court has never said this in the past. It has spoken about strict due diligence. It has spoken about reinforced due diligence, but this is at a higher level. You know, when it comes to sexual violence against girls, And the court really emphasizes that this is a case that was 20 years in impunity, right? Which is quite outrageous, for the gravity of the facts that we're discussing today. The court also discusses as independent duties under the American Convention, this duty to respect and ensure of special protection and to not re-victimize girls and their family members when they navigate the justice system, right? And this is very significant. The court has discussed in the past, right? The fact that these are obligations, but this is the first time that the court treats them as independent and autonomous obligations under the American Convention. This could open the door for other cases in which the court can give more content and more guidance to states of how to not re-victimize, in these kinds of cases. The other thing that's very significant on that first point is that the court provides landmark criteria for physical exams. The reality is that what happened to Brisa in her physical exam is outrageous, is unacceptable, is emblematic of a lot of the physical exams that girls in the region go through when there are allegations and cases of sexual violence. The court advances criteria for these kinds of physical exams. The survivors should be able to select the sex of the professional. Children have a right to be heard, and they should be joined by a person that they trust. And also, the court underscores something that it has said in the past that's very important, that the word and testimony of girls in these cases should be a primary source of evidence in these kinds of cases. A second point where I think the judgment is extremely important is it draws this connection between intersectional discrimination and reinforced due diligence in the investigation of these cases. The court has been evolving in its jurisprudence, and it keeps on using intersectionality in this approach, when it comes to discrimination, and the fact that there are women and girls that are more exposed to human rights violations, or at least at an increased risk to human rights violations because of their age, because of their gender, because of their sex. And it did reinforce that connection in this case. And I think also a very significant fact in this case is that it talked about those two connections, and then it added gender stereotypes. And this is extremely important. The court has been developing a line of cases on gender stereotypes. This is one of the strongest cases that I've seen on gender stereotypes and how they negatively affect the work of justice officials. And for those of you that are students here, gender stereotypes can be in the form of the kind of questions that you ask a survivor, that has brought forth a case before the justice system, blaming them for behavior or the way they dress, blaming them for an act that they didn't consent to. Okay? And I have a third point on consent, because I think this is actually one of the most important parts of the judgment. I actually think this is one of the parts that the judgment is going to be remembered for, is that the court really analyzes in detail the standard of consent, and how consent or non-consent or this element should be the primary element in laws related to sexual violence, right? And one of my favorite parts of the judgment is how the court very carefully reviews a lot of the international standards in this area. It talks about the rulings of the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia and the European Court of Human Rights. It talks about the Istanbul Convention, the European Convention on Violence Against Women. It talks about the CEDAW committee decision in the case of Karen Tayak Vertido, and it actually espouses General Recommendation 3 of the MESECB committee of the OAS, which is really important because this is a committee of gender experts that the Organization of American States has that is ruling these very groundbreaking recommendations on women's rights issues. And I was very pleased to see that the court espoused this expertise, that the OAS has. The court also provides specific guidance to states on how consent should be reflected in laws. It also confirms that consent should not be inferred when there is an authority figure involved. When we have, a girl that's involved, especially a girl under 18 years old, and when there are situations of threats. This is groundbreaking. The court has never done this. So this is one of the most important parts of the judgment. And lastly, I want to highlight the reparations, because the reparations are very detailed and extensive in this particular case. Is one of the most extensive cases I've ever seen the Inter-American Court of Human Rights adopt in the area of gender issues and reparations, especially on legislation. You have a regional court that directly tells a state Your legislation doesn't work when it comes to sexual violence against girls. Very direct statement, right? This is supposed to be a supranational body, right? And they ordered the state of Bolivia to reform their legislation on sexual violence to conform to international standards concerning sexual violence and consent. They need to modify the crime of stupro, which is based on gender stereotypes. It also calls the state of Bolivia to give visibility to sexual, or what we call in Spanish, violencia sexual incestuosa, but in English it would be incestuous sexual violence in the Bolivian criminal code as an autonomous crime, right? You know, and this is also part of a very well-known concurring opinion at this point. And then you have a court giving a very detailed list of actions that states, not only Bolivia, but that states in general should take to prevent the repetition of these acts in the future, including the adoption protocols, training and awareness raising campaigns, sexual education, and national and centralized systems to collect data on sexual violence against women. I just want to end briefly highlighting some hopes that I have for the future, you know, when it comes to this jurisprudence by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I think this case is a landmark, right? And unfortunately, we are trying to avoid the repetition of these cases in the Americas, but I get a sense that the court is going to receive more cases, especially after this kind of landmark judgment. I think in the future, it would be really important for the court to give more meat and content to what that duty of prevention is for states within the Convention of Belém do Pará, which is the most important violence against women treaty in the Americas. The court does this in the non-repetition or reparation section, right? But I actually would love to see it more as a benchmark. The states have to be ready, right? This is not just about acting after the cases have been reported before the authorities. There has to be adequate prevention measures. We have this huge and emblematic problem of violence against women and girls. If courts are only focusing on the aspect of justice and they're not focusing on prevention, we're going to continue seeing cases, right? So I would love for the court to pivot more of that analysis more towards the content of prevention. And this is something that we were trying to do as a litigation team, right? So hopefully there will be an accomplishment of this in the future. The other thing is, I think it would be great for the court to really elaborate on what it means by rectification and its reparations analysis. Reparations really in the past have been more focused on restitution or trying to bring the survivor and the family members to their former position before human rights violations were committed. I think we're at a stage, you know, where the court has started talking about transformative reparations. What does it mean to transform these contexts of discrimination? I think it's very important to see more analysis of what the court means on this. I also would like to see more analysis of the need for humane treatment for survivors and their family members when they try to navigate the justice system. The treatment that Brisa and her family members received when they were trying to avail themselves of justice mechanisms in Bolivia was dismal. It was a form of violence in itself. It's what we call institutional violence. The court starts discussing this. This is also in other cases, but I really would love to see more development of this in the future, especially in the case of girls. And lastly, the court in its judgment, this is in paragraph 103, for those of you that want to read this judgment, you know, or have read it, the court hints at how important this participation and information is for girls in justice system mechanisms when they are taking cases before the justice system. This is very important because the Inter-American Court has been gravitating toward an approach towards girls and women that's more thinking autonomy, thinking empowerment, thinking they should have an influence, they should have a voice, not just victimhood, right? So this is extremely important. In the case of girls, we already have a general comment on this by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you know, the general comment on the right to be heard. The court has started developing this concept, but I do think it's extremely important to develop it more in cases where girls do not have that right protected, you know, when they are taking cases before the justice system. I'm going to end there, but again, it's a wonderful judgment. We can always nitpick the judgment, right? That's what we do in academia. We love picking on judgments and, you know, but I do think that it is a very significant judgment for girls who have suffered sexual violence and incest in the Americas. And hopefully it does push the court to produce more important jurisprudence in this area and to not repeat these acts, which is really what Brisa has been working for all her life, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Celorio, for driving us through the whole process of the court and the main the standards that the court is taking and elevate it to another level. Now we're going to be talking to Jada Benz and Alisa Johnson. They're going to take us a little bit more deep into the reparations sections. And since Celorio was saying, this is a very unique case on reparations because the court went very detailed, very expand and huge on reparations. And, you know, we work on that. It was a strategy behind it. First of all, because as Brisa mentioned, she didn't want any individual reparation. But at the same time, we, you know, as human rights lawyers, we've been fighting for this reparation. So we need to present it to the court that it was not individual reparations, but these special measures, these non-repetition measures was reparations for her, right? This is what she needed to get justice. So to go deeply on those reparations, I will let them.
So thank you all for being here. It's really wonderful to have so many people support and okay. So it's wonderful to see so many people here and online who are aware of this case and are interested because I think it's such an important issue, and the more people know and are talking about it, the better. So one of the things that I think is most unique about this entire case is that, and Brisa touched on this when she spoke, is that our petitioner here, Brisa, is not only the petitioner, but also an expert in her own right. And so that allowed us to have this very unique situation where the reparations we were requesting were substantive, and they weren't based on one person's experience. They were based on one person's experience in addition to many others because of the nature of the work that she does on the ground. So when we came to the court with these requests, they were specific, based on knowledge, based on experience. And at the hearing, when Brisa was able to speak to the judges and describe her personal experience on the ground, I think that made a huge impact. And even though I personally feel that's part of the reason we got so many of the reparations that we did, is because they understood that this was almost expert advice that Bolivia was getting on ways that it could reform its laws, ways that it could reform its protocols, in a way that would actually make a difference and be effective. So I think that was a really unique aspect of this particular case, and part of why the reparations are so strong, right? I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think another really unique aspect of our request for reparations was that, as we've been saying, Brisa didn't request any individual compensation. And I think that tends to be one of the requests for reparations that courts have a difficult time grappling with. And I get the sense, just reading the judgment, that in this case, the court was somewhat relieved not to have to go into those details. And I think, Brisa really drove the strategy on that decision. And I think based on her knowledge of how Bolivia would react to our requests and how the request would be seen in Bolivia, really drove how we came to that decision. And, we went back and forth on it quite a bit as a team. And in the end, I think it really paid off in that the court really focused on the structural reforms, historic measures. So,
yeah, and so I think Dean Celorio already took you through all the reparations, but I guess just to highlight a few that I think are particularly significant. The court's decision around the change to the laws is very specific. So I think Dean Celorio already mentioned that. Well, so let me back up. In the judgment, the court is very respectful, tries to be very respectful of Bolivia, and actually begins by acknowledging that Bolivia has made amendments to its laws. They have, they do have certain laws that are attempting to be more victim friendly, but then after that kind of paragraph, they're like, okay, but your standards are still not complying with international standards, and here's why. And I think the forcefulness with which the court kind of makes that statement and the specificity with which it asks the court, Bolivia, to change particularly its consent, its rape laws, to incorporate consent is really powerful. So that's one aspect of the reparations that I thought was significant. And they also ask for, they also order Bolivia to make amendments to some of the other laws as well, like incest, that Jean Soloria mentioned. The second piece that I thought was really significant was that the court orders Bolivia to implement 3 specific protocols related to how victims of sexual violence are treated, including in like the forensic exam. And for each of those protocols, the court actually lays out in detail what needs to be included. So it's very specific, and I think these international bodies or these regional bodies tend to try to be more deferential to states and their legislative processes. So for a court to go so far as to say you need to implement not only laws, but protocols with these specific things included is quite, I think, quite significant. And then the last thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is this order to collect statistics. Because if we're talking about prevention measures, one of the big gaps I think we have in a lot of countries is just knowledge on the numbers, like how many victims, what is the nature of their circumstances, what are the roadblocks, right? So the more countries can invest resources and prioritize data collection, the better we're all poised, both the government and the human rights activists to address the specific issues. So yeah, I think those are a few particularly significant aspects of the reparations.
Thank you both. I think that when I read the reparation part, and specifically when the specificness of all the consent part and the elimination of estupro, it makes my heart like, oh wow, this is huge, and because it's something that many of us, is this not just this team? Is this a movement around the world that has been moving this conversation about not focusing these cases on the use of force, right? Don't stop focusing that sexual violence is regarding the use of force. Need to be moved to the lack of consent. And for that, we in Equality Now, we've been, when Brisa came to our organization, that Shelby reminds me that was around 2013. And we started working with her and with other colleagues in health and human rights. It was a long process to build all this knowledge. And we even in 2020 launched a report on failing to protect is the name. And it goes through analysis on all the laws in Americas, including some states in the United States, Canada, and you can see similar reports from other countries in the world, so South Asia, Eurasia. As you see, that is, there's the same gaps in the laws, and we cannot, this is just the law. We can keep talking about prevention and the other measures that the court recommend to Bolivia. But to talking a little bit more about the strategy, about the amicus, who were the experts in this case, and all the work that we've been building for all this year, waiting for the decision of the court, 13 years. I'm gonna let Shelby Quast. Shelby Quast she's the former director of Americas from Equality Now. Now she has her own firm. So, and she recruits always young, brave women rights lawyers. To talk a little bit more about the big picture and the strategy.
So as Barbara mentioned, part of this was when Brisa came to us, and she had put the case, it had gone to the commission, and it was sitting there, and the thought is, what could we do? How can we assist? What needs to happen? What are the different things? And that bigger picture was, think we saw that this is happening around the world. This sexual violence against girls in the family, outside the family. We had been seeing that at Equality Now in various countries. And how is this case emblematic of what's going on around the world? And what do we need to do to make sure it gets forward? That Brisa's experience is the experience of so many. We knew as a small human rights organization, women's rights organization, that we needed to ensure that there was longevity and if you will, kind of that strength behind the advocacy. And that's Hughes, Hubbard and Reed, was coming to a law firm that could stand by this case in Washington, D.C. and be available to the commission. And we knew that was a key piece of this. Brisa sold them quite well, introducing this story and why it needed that type of support. It's seen partners, it's seen many associates, just like at Equality Now, we'd seen many associates go through this. Tanya Sukija Cohen, Krista Stewart, Carla Torres, Barbara Jimenez. So a lot of people came onto this case because it was long-term. And I think that that's one of the things is they are long-term. And many of these cases who have very strong victims who have experienced violations, horrific violations, they never make it to the court. They never make it to the commission. And very few cases that come to the commission actually progress to the court. So this was an unusual circumstance. It wasn't guaranteed that this case would make it to the court, but took a great deal of effort and engaging with the United Nations. Why did they need to care about a case in Bolivia against one individual? Why did CEDAW at the United Nations need to care? Ms. Ekby, why did they need to come in at the OAS? So why was this case so important? And why did we need the World Health Organization to be engaged? All these people who knew about sexual violence against girls and adolescents, a lot of people were they cared very much about Brisa as an individual, but they didn't necessarily see this case in Bolivia as being primary to their work, as being actually groundbreaking to what it is they're trying to achieve. There's a global partnership to end violence against children. We need to pull them in and see that this specific case in Bolivia was representative of girls around the world, not just in Bolivia, not just in the region, but really around the world. And part of that was communications, elevating the communications, elevating the platforms where Brisa was able to share her story and what she was doing to address sexual violence in Bolivia. This was much less of a case about an individual who had experienced violations in the past, and much more about the fact that it was still ongoing today, and that Brisa was fighting it every day in Bolivia, but again, not just in Cochabamba, Bolivia, all around the world, all around the state, and getting people to come in. So coming back to the question about the amicus briefs and involving experts, it was important that they saw this as central to their work, that they saw the potential of this case, the outcome that the court might deliver as strong, as something that would move the ball forward. The Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations talk about ending sexual violence against children. This was a key case to take that forward, just as looking at what was happening with the WHO, who had issued protocols around proper health care and forensics for children who had experienced sexual violence. Again, all of this was coming together in this singular case, and calling on those experts to weigh in as amicus briefs and help the court not only with technical issues on what can they do. So we had the former special rapporteur on violence against women from the United Nations, Dubravka Simonovic. Sylvia Mensa came in from the McSevy committee. We had WHO, who couldn't actually sign on, but they could give us all their information to make it inside the brief. The Global Women's Institute, Mary Ellsberg is here, led a brief of very key partners, Together for Girls, Futures Without Violence. These are organizations that work on these issues, but didn't necessarily see Bolivia as within their framework. One of the other key issues is so many donors didn't see Bolivia within their framework. And trying to put this on track so that they understood this is your framework. This is the highest court that is going to hear a case on sexual violence against girls and adolescents. The work that's being done by a small organization in Cochabamba, Bolivia, is showing how they can address it. And I think bringing in those experts to ensure that they centralized this work was incredibly key. Not only, as I said, as technical expertise for the court. And the court does cite that they looked at these briefs that were submitted to them by neutral parties. They looked at the standards and the protocols and they used them. And that was incredibly strong. But that idea that this is long-term, it's not a short time win. It took a lot of effort, and that we need to make sure that the funders who are supporting this kind of work can take it on for the long term. That they're committed to, no, this isn't just a one-year program, but in this case, we're talking 20 years. It's not that unusual when a case would come to the commission that it sat there for a long time. And the first time that Scott Christensen, a former partner at Hughes Hubbard and Reed, and I walked in, it was under a pile of stacks and stacks and stacks of cases. So to get them to remove that, because part of that was, this isn't a case that happened in the past. This is urgent. It is happening to girls every single day that you don't act. So that was part of the strategy of not only bringing people in to provide, as I said, technical expertise, but getting them to commit to taking this forward. Are we going to have second round of questions, or do you want me to touch on any?
Yes, touch on.
So the other piece that I really want to touch on, and I think this is huge in the case, because again, it's not specific just to Bolivia. The decision was, but what comes out, and I think this was huge in the court's decision, that it said judicial ineffectiveness in individual cases of violence against women fosters an environment of impunity that facilitates and promotes repetition of acts of violence in general and sends a message that violence against women can be tolerated and accepted. Impunity is rife across Bolivia, but it's rife across the region and the world. And this idea that they came in and they said, now they didn't say it in the body, but they did say it in the reparations, that the state has to implement an awareness and sensitization campaign through an open, through all various channels to the public to say that this type of behavior is wrong. It will not be tolerated. We have laws against it and we're implementing them. That they're going to train children in schools to understand their rights. And what does it mean when a family member is trying to have sex with you, or consent issues? So those are the bigger issues for me. It's saying very closely, we're going to hold you accountable for impunity. If you don't act to prevent sexual violence, whether you know it's happening behind closed doors in this house, you know it's happening behind many closed doors. So you need to address that. And then just jump on that one other piece about data keeping. It's not just data of who's experienced sexual violence, but what becomes incredibly important is this case asks for a centralized collection of data on cases of sexual violence against minors, disaggregated by age, place of occurrence, profile of the aggressor, relationship of the victim. Now for me, another very big piece, the number of cases that were effectively prosecuted should be specified, identifying the number of indictments, convictions, and acquittals. So oftentimes a law is on the books, protocols are in place, a case is brought, and it never goes to conviction. And identifying where that's happening really, again, addresses impunity. Because when you see cases and you see girls use their voice and you see it shut down, that promotes impunity. And the court here is trying to say, no, let's address impunity. States, you have a responsibility. And the last tiny bit is the court has said, and this is unique for the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we will oversee implementation of these reparations. We're not just telling you to do it, but we're actually going to watch you do it. And you need to report back to us. And you need to tell us what you've done every year for a period of 5 years. And I'm calling on everybody in this room, especially those who signed on to amicus briefs and whatnot, that you also need to be party to ensuring that these things happen. And it's a global issue. The Global Partnership for Children to End Violence, the UNICEF, the WHO, they all need to be looking at Bolivia as an example to take it forward. And that way, this case will have reached beyond Bolivia, beyond the region, and really around the world for girls that experience or need to be prevented from sexual violence.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelby. And talking about implementation, I'm going to give you a few minutes to Brisa before going to the questions about what's been the reaction at the local level. I know it's always the question, what is the reaction of this judgment? What is happening beyond all the interviews that you're being giving? I don't know, so many hours of it, but what is happening in the ground and what we've been planning to do there?
Yeah, I think I want to start with something that Rosa Celorio said the first time that I met her. I was just wanting to know how a commission works or what a petition is. And she was a commissioner there, right?
An attorney at the secretariat.
There, she was somewhere there.
The hard work.
But she was like, to me, she was like this really huge person that was going to see us and give me a little bit of insight. And when I got there, I was really angry. I was like, we need to punish the government and we need to do this. And I was just like angry. And she said to me, we need to be friends with the state so that change actually happens. And that was really hard for me because it started changing the way that I see things. It's like, okay, how can I kind of bring into awareness what you're doing, that what you're doing is wrong, but at the same time, I'm doing this with the point of working together. So that has been a very like slippery slope balance of wanting to like keep the government accountable, but at the same time, like with how do we work together on this? This is not just, and I realized that when we go on, like, there's a space for it. I'm not saying there isn't, but like when you don't go and poke them, they're more receptive. So on the trial, they were extremely aggressive and mean, and after the trial and before the judgment, but after the judgment, it's like 180 switch. They've been so nice. They've all been talking about like this marvelous thing that Brisa has done. And there's 3 cases that won against Bolivia. 2 of them, they get money reparations, I think like $1.5 million. And the way they express themselves about these cases is like, you can see this anger toward these other cases. And they always say, but Brisa's case, it's helping us change Bolivia. And like, it's completely different. I've been having calls from like the district attorneys, like, how can we train all the prosecutors? Can we train all the judges? Can you provide us this training that you've been doing? My expertise is neuropsychologist. Like, so all the judges have to go through this training of neuropsychology, and all the prosecutors have to be going through neuropsychology. They need to understand how trauma works so that when they reach children, so many things are changing. And then they're like, oh, and we also want you to be as an expert watching like the protocols. So I'm like, this is really cool. It's like, it's way more than I thought. So it's very exciting to see that change is possible. That even though there's a lot of limitations, it's brought hope to people. And my foundation is Una Brisa de Esperanza, a breeze of hope. And so they're calling me like the breeze of hope, because I think it's given that hope that change is possible, that we can work together. And one really important thing is how to bring the different sectors together. We tend to work in silos, and that has been damaging in a lot of ways because we can become very expert, but be ignorant of like all the other things that are happening. But when we can build bridges, like here we have, and that's something that judgment does. It brings like the medical system has to be involved, the educational system has to be there, the judicial system. And now we have all these people coming together, bringing their perspective, academic researchers, practitioners, survivors. It's like, it's amazing when we can see like start opening. So it's very exciting. A few minutes.
Thank you, Brisa. Okay, any question for the public or from Zoom? Yes, Benny.
All right, so the microphone. Yeah, I think it's Zoom. Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all very much for this very informative panel. I thought it was really enlightening. So my question, I guess, is then for Brisa. I was just wondering, following this judgment of the case, have you seen through your work any changes in the social attitudes on the ground? I know you were mentioning earlier that there was like a lot of issues of victim shaming. So I was wondering if you've seen any changes in that regard.
Yeah, does this work? Okay, how does this work? So yes, the day after the judgment came out, some judges were using the wording of consent in 2 of the trials that we were taking on court. And they were like, we're not going to even talk about consent because this is an adult and this is a child, and the judgment of the court says blah, 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 blah. So we immediately saw the difference. Also, the difference with me, I have a trial next week against my aggressor, 21 years later. He's not going to come to the trial. It's still going to be open. But they're putting protection for my family and for me, and they're activating all these things. And it's like, whoa, okay. The treatment that I'm getting from the prosecutors, but also the treatment, the girls that we take to court. So we have a foundation there. We take trials almost every single day. We've seen a huge difference of people starting to use the judgment to the treatment of how girls are doing. And I think the willingness and wanting to make a difference is the hugest difference that I've seen. Like they want to learn, they want to change, they want to have the skills to know how to do forensic interviewing. So I think that's been huge.
Any questions? Okay, I will read the one that is on the Facebook. If Brisa will be taking questions later, I would like to know if she could provide any specific tips for advocates working with trauma survivors. Is there anything in particular that she has found helpful or harmful within the course of her work?
I think there's a lot of things. One of the recommendations that I would give is that anyone working with survivors should be trauma informed and have the course. It should be a requirement for all law students to have trauma-informed training. And that's one thing we're doing in Bolivia is we're changing the curriculum in law schools, social work, psychology. They have to be trained on trauma-informed. But simple phrases, like the first time I met Shelby, when she was working with Equality Now, she looked at me and she was honest. She said, this is a long road. And if you choose to take it, I will never leave you alone. And she left Equality Now, and she still was my lawyer. And that sentence, after being left alone so many times, this was not about her job. This was not about where she was working. This was about being there for me. And one time there was someone from the government in Bolivia who was being really mean to me, and Shelby stood in front of him and said, if you have anything to say, you're going to talk to me because I'm Brisa's lawyer. And I felt so proud. I have my own lawyer. But just that level of your pain matters and you matter as a human being, it makes a whole difference. It makes the whole difference of having people who, Hughes, Haber, Reed, like, how are you emotionally? Like, how are you doing? Like, just caring that this is not just about the law, but this is about a human being who's being hurt, and we're here for you. So I think that's the humanity. I just want to bring back the humanity. We forget about it, and especially in law school, where we're trained to like how to defend, how to fight, and we start reading all these cases that we become very like specific on the laws. But many times we lose the humanity. So it's like, this is a real person. If it was me, if it was my brother, it was my sister, my child, how would I respond? And I think that makes a huge difference on the healing process, which I think should be the ultimate goal of law and everything that we do. Is like, how do we bring healing to someone who's been through a difficult time?
Any other question?
First, I wanted to say thank you so very much for sharing your story and for sharing your experience of activism and advocacy. It's really very empowering, and I can't thank you enough for sharing it. As a student of political science, what really stood out to me about the opinion was the statutory changes that resulted in the reparations. Having studied a lot of white papers and resolutions and documents that fight for change and ask for change to be made, it seems like it's really difficult to actually garner that change through documentation alone. So I wanted to know if you think, all of you as a panel, if the future of creating that statutory change that so many governments need can come through suits and lawsuits against governments that fail to uphold that duty of protection.
I'm going to give a really quick answer and then I'm going to pass it. But I think someone here, Mary Ellsberg, is someone that I work really close with. But we've learned that things in paper are not going to change if they're not coupled with activism. And that's why we need to partner with activists in the countries, in look at feminists, at groups of, because really like it's been women who've been like pushing it. Like changes really happen with women, and some men. But we have to realize, like, sorry, here's my like. But it's true, we have to partner with activism. Otherwise, they just stay in paper. So the judgment is great, but it would just be a paper if we were not partnering with activists on the ground saying, hey, remember you said you were going to do this, and pushing, and organizations and civil society saying, hey, we're going to push until the end, until you show us. The papers help us, give us power to do it, but the papers alone won't do it, and the activism alone won't do it. It's like, that's why it's like so important to get all together.
I'm going to touch on that too, if I can. And one of those things is a law doesn't change behavior. Implementation of a law changes behavior, but laws are in the hands of people, not just lawyers, but it's in the hands of the people to change things. And it sets a bar that people can try to achieve. But it is really important that people take that action to demand their rights, to hold accountability. But it really is a tool in the hands of the people. And I give the example, it's like a knife. And if you have a knife with a sheath on it in the drawer, and you don't take it out, it can't do anything. You have to take it out. You have to take the sheath off. You have to sharpen it, and then you have to use it. So the law by itself doesn't make change, but it was never intended to. It allows people to modify their behavior. And the other thing I think that Brisa really pointed out that's happening now is this is part of a cultural practice. And as one, it can change. And it is changing. And it can change quickly to where you're defending a practice because you don't want to change to, oh, we have to change? Yes, sexual violence against children is bad. Having sex with someone in your family, that's bad. And I think those kinds of things happen. But again, it's all about each one of us stepping up and ensuring that it's being implemented and holding each other accountable. It's not just for the courts. It's not just for officials. It's not just for people who have professional titles. It really is for every one of us to ensure that those rights are protected and to make those changes in our own lives and the people that we know. So,
comments? We have one from. You have given hope to so many people, yet I will imagine that going through so many years of resistance to your case and having to advocate for yourself so fiercely against so many antagonists over the years. Hope might have been hard to hold on to. What has given you hope and sustained you as you carry this case forward?
I have given up so many times. And then I wake up again and I was like, what did I say yesterday? And I keep on going. But I think my biggest hope is seeing children. When I see a child and I think of the possibility of the beauty that they could be, but also the possibility of them going through what I went through, I just can't. Every time I make a decision, this is it, I let it go, and I could be doing so many other things. And then I wake up and I think about that child who's going to sleep, crying just like I did, and no one there. I just can't. My children, your children, they're my biggest inspiration. They're my biggest hope, but it's been really hard. I don't think people know how hard it is behind doors, and all the tears and all the anger and all the nights of days of not eating because of the stress. My poor children know, having to, that this is something that impacted generations. My parents were affected terribly from this, and their whole life has changed. My life has been, but now my children's lives are being affected. It's like a transgenerational damage. But I think that's what created me hope, is to see that it is possible. And that, with the children that I take every day in our program, when I change a tear for a smile, that there's no, I could be offered a $10 million job. There's no way I would ever take it,
because there's nothing in this world that could create the joy of being able to make the difference in a child's life. It just, yeah. I don't know how to answer the question.
I will. I think with those words, I think if anyone else have anything to say, I think we can wrap up. And thank you, Brisa, always for bringing us hope. I think always inspiring us to keep this fight and continue pushing. And this is just a start. I think we said like we finishing the course, and we are now going to Bolivia to continue working there, implementing, monitoring everything that is going on there, and also with all partners and people around the world, moving the conversation at the region and the globe. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Program of International and Comparative Law for having us. Thank you for the partners and colleagues, lawyers, and thank you very much, and see you soon. Thank you for the people in their homes.